Only a monster could do that. Only a person that has no regard for human life, especially for a baby, could do something that extreme.
Imagine ending a relationship because you believe you have finally found the courage to walk away. You have children to protect. You have a future you want to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, you begin to believe that life might actually get better. But then, someone from your past comes back. And according to prosecutors, what happened next turned an ordinary Cleveland neighborhood into the scene of one of the city's most devastating quadruple murders. 4 people would be dead. A young mother, 2 innocent children, and a neighbor who may have encountered the killer at the worst possible moment. The accused killer was someone the victim knew intimately, someone she had once planned to marry, someone who was also the father of one of her children. His name was Armand Johnson Sr., and today, on Crime of Desire, we're going back to the 2019 Slavic Village murders, a case involving allegations of domestic abuse, a relationship falling apart, a house engulfed in flames, a mysterious text message, forensic evidence, and a courtroom battle that eventually ended with 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But before we go any further, subscribe to Crime of Desire and turn on notifications if you want more carefully researched true crime stories. And while you're watching, tell me in the comments, at what point do you think this relationship crossed from a troubled breakup into a situation that should have been treated as an immediate danger? Because the warning signs were there, and according to evidence later presented in court, they were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It was 2019. 25-year-old Takeyra Collins was living in Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood with her children. Her 6-year-old son, Armand Johnson Jr., was the son of Armand Johnson Sr. Her 2-year-old daughter, Aubrey Stone, was also living in the home. At one point, Takeyra and Armand had been engaged. They were planning to get married. But their relationship had become increasingly troubled. According to evidence introduced at trial, Takeyra had accused Johnson of abusive behavior. In messages between the two, she accused him of pulling her hair, calling her names, and even pulling a gun on her. Johnson apologized for some of his behavior and asked for another chance. But Takeyra appeared to be reaching a different conclusion. She wanted out. And this wasn't simply a case of 2 people deciding they weren't compatible anymore. According to testimony presented later, people around Takeyra noticed signs that something was wrong. One of her co-workers, Tameko Dillard, testified that Takeyra arrived at work on June 17th with a busted lip and bruises. She was reportedly having difficulty performing her normal duties because of her injuries. For prosecutors, this testimony became part of a much larger picture. A woman attempting to leave a relationship that had allegedly become dangerous. And then there was something else. Takeyra had reportedly been searching online for information related to domestic violence. She looked into questions involving an abusive father, and whether a child could refuse to see a father who had allegedly abused the child's mother. She was also reportedly considering moving into a domestic violence safe house and changing her phone number. Think about that for a moment. She wasn't simply complaining about an argument. According to the evidence, she was looking for a way to separate herself from the relationship and protect herself. And yet, the relationship wasn't disappearing quietly. In June, Takeyra made it clear that the engagement was over. Johnson knew she was moving on, and according to the evidence presented at trial, the 2 were increasingly communicating about practical matters such as their children and bills, rather than rebuilding their relationship. There was also another man in Takeyra's life, a man identified in court records as Sims. Her co-worker described Takeyra as appearing happy with him, and during the 4th of July weekend, Takeyra and Sims traveled to Chicago. For someone trying to start over, it may have felt like a new chapter. But prosecutors would later argue that Johnson was not prepared to simply accept the end of the relationship. And then came July 8, 2019. What happened that day would eventually become the center of a murder prosecution. According to prosecutors, Johnson went to Takeyra's home. The evidence presented at trial indicated that Takeyra was shot multiple times. The medical examiner found 10 gunshot wounds, and the wounds were not limited to one area. There were injuries to her head, torso, and arms. But perhaps the most important forensic finding was what wasn't found. There was no smoke in Takeyra's lungs. That meant she had already died before the fire began. The prosecution's theory was devastating. Takeyra had been shot first. Then the house was deliberately set on fire. And inside that burning home were 2 children, 6-year-old Armand Jr. and 2-year-old Aubrey. The children did not die from gunshot wounds. They died from smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning. 2 little children trapped inside a burning home after their mother had already been killed. And that wasn't the end of the tragedy. Outside the home, another man was lying dead. His name was David Cousin Jr. He was 35 years old. Cousin had been found in an open lot near the house after being fatally shot. Investigators believed he may have encountered the suspect. There were questions about whether he had attempted to help or intervene. But regardless of exactly what happened in those final moments, one fact was undeniable. 4 people had lost their lives. Takeyra Collins, her 6-year-old son, her 2-year-old daughter, and her 35-year-old neighbor. The neighborhood was now a crime scene, and investigators needed to answer one enormous question. Who had done this? The answer, prosecutors believed, was someone who knew the victim. Someone with a personal connection to the home. Someone who knew the children. Someone who had allegedly been involved in a deteriorating relationship with Takeyra. And police quickly focused their attention on Armand Johnson Sr. He was arrested on July 9th, the day after the murders were discovered. But investigators didn't simply have the relationship history. They had forensic evidence, and some of it would become extremely important in court. Investigators recovered a gas can near Takeyra's body. Johnson's DNA was found on the handle. There was also evidence involving Takeyra's cell phone. Johnson's DNA was found on the phone, and prosecutors argued that the phone had been used after the murders to send messages designed to make investigators suspect someone else. That detail would become one of the strangest pieces of the case. Because shortly after the murders, a message was presented to police suggesting that another man, Aubrey's father, Michael Stone, had been at the house with a gun and was threatening to burn the property. Investigators looked into Stone. They investigated other potential suspects as well. But prosecutors eventually argued that the message was part of an attempt to misdirect investigators. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence continued to build. Takeyra's blood was found on clothing and shoes associated with Johnson. There was evidence of gasoline and Takeyra's blood on his shoes, and ballistics evidence connected 9mm shell casings found near Takeyra and David Cousin to the same firearm. Then investigators found something else on Johnson's phone. A photograph from June showed what appeared to be a semi-automatic pistol with an extended magazine on a bedspread in Takeyra's bedroom. That photograph became another piece of the prosecution's case, but there was still a long road ahead. Johnson was facing some of the most serious charges imaginable. The indictment included multiple counts of aggravated murder, aggravated arson, aggravated burglary, child endangerment, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. And prosecutors initially pursued the death penalty. But Johnson would not go to trial immediately. The case would take years to reach a courtroom. And when the trial finally arrived in 2022, prosecutors would have to convince a jury that all of these pieces, the relationship history, the alleged abuse, the cell phone evidence, the DNA, the blood, the firearm evidence, and the fire, formed one coherent story. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. And the stakes couldn't have been higher, because this wasn't simply about determining whether Armand Johnson had committed a crime. The jury had to decide whether the evidence proved, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was responsible for the deaths of 4 people, including his own 6-year-old son. And there was one question hanging over everything. Why? Was this the final explosion of a relationship that had been deteriorating for months? Was jealousy involved? Was anger over the breakup involved? Was the fire intended to destroy evidence? Or was there another explanation for what happened inside that Cleveland home? Those questions would become central to the courtroom battle. And when the trial finally began, prosecutors would reveal evidence that they believed could answer them. But the most disturbing part of the story was still ahead, because the evidence would take us inside the final days of Takeyra's relationship with Johnson and reveal just how quickly the situation appeared to escalate. And then came the evidence that prosecutors believed showed what happened after Takeyra was already dead. If you were following this case at the time, that was the moment when the story became even more difficult to comprehend. A mother was dead. 2 children were trapped in a burning house. A neighbor was dead outside, and investigators believed someone had tried to leave behind a trail pointing toward another suspect. But would the jury believe it? And what would Johnson say about the evidence against him? That's where we're going next. If you haven't already, subscribe to Crime of Desire, because the next part of this video will take us into the courtroom, the forensic evidence, the defense's arguments, the death penalty decision, Johnson's final sentence, and the appeal that followed. And I want to hear from you. Do you believe the evidence described so far was enough to identify the killer? Or would you have wanted more before reaching a guilty verdict? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and remember, every detail matters. When the trial of Armand Johnson Sr. finally began, prosecutors were not asking the jury to look at one isolated piece of evidence. They were asking them to look at an entire chain of events. A relationship that had collapsed, allegations of abuse, a woman trying to separate herself from that relationship, a deadly confrontation, a house set on fire, 2 children trapped inside, a neighbor shot outside, and forensic evidence that prosecutors said connected Johnson to the crime scene. But the defense had a different job. Their job was to challenge that chain. Because in a criminal courtroom, suspicion isn't enough. A defendant doesn't have to prove his innocence. The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that standard would be critical in the case against Johnson. The prosecution began by laying out the relationship between Johnson and Takeyra Collins. They wanted the jury to understand what had happened in the weeks leading up to the murders. According to the evidence, Takeyra had accused Johnson of abusive behavior. She had reportedly suffered visible injuries. She had searched for domestic violence resources. And she had decided to end their engagement. To prosecutors, these weren't random details. They were evidence of motive. But the defense challenged the way some of that history was being used. Johnson's attorneys argued that evidence about previous allegations of abuse could unfairly influence the jury and make them view him as a bad person rather than determine whether he committed the murders. The appellate court would later consider that argument, and ultimately, it sided with the prosecution. The appeals court concluded that the evidence concerning the deteriorating relationship and alleged abuse was relevant to issues such as motive, intent, and identity. In other words, the court accepted the argument that the relationship history helped explain why Johnson might have been responsible for the killings. But the prosecution still needed something stronger than motive. They needed evidence connecting Johnson directly to the crime, and that's where the forensic evidence became crucial. Investigators found Takeyra's blood on clothing and shoes associated with Johnson. Gasoline and Takeyra's blood were found on his shoes. Johnson's DNA was found on a gas can recovered near Takeyra's body. And Johnson's DNA was also found on Takeyra's cell phone. Each piece mattered, but prosecutors weren't finished. They also presented evidence involving the gun. Ballistics evidence connected 9mm shell casings found near Takeyra and David Cousin to the same firearm. That was important because the prosecution believed the same weapon had been used to kill both adults. And then there was the cell phone evidence. The prosecution argued that Johnson had access to Takeyra's phone after the killings. Why was that important? Because someone had used the phone to send messages that pointed investigators toward another man. That other man was Michael Stone, Aubrey's father. The message reportedly suggested Stone had been at the home with a gun and was threatening to burn the house. Imagine investigators receiving information like that after discovering 4 bodies. Their first responsibility would be to determine whether the accusation was true. So they investigated, Stone was investigated, other possible suspects were investigated, but according to the evidence later summarized by the appeals court, investigators eventually excluded those alternative suspects, and prosecutors argued that the message wasn't a genuine clue. They argued that it was a deliberate attempt to create one, an attempt to send investigators in the wrong direction. And if that interpretation was correct, it suggested something even more disturbing. Someone wasn't simply trying to escape. Someone was allegedly trying to manipulate the investigation. But the defense continued to challenge the prosecution's case. And this is where the courtroom became a battle over interpretation. DNA doesn't tell a jury why someone's DNA is somewhere. A person's DNA can be found on an object for many reasons. The defense could question how and when that DNA got there. Blood evidence could show that a person's blood was present. But again, the defense could challenge the circumstances. Cell phone evidence could establish connections between people and locations. But it still had to be interpreted. The prosecution's argument was that all these pieces made sense when viewed together. The defense argued that the evidence needed to be examined carefully, rather than simply accepted as one story. But there was another piece of evidence prosecutors believed was especially important: the history between Johnson and Takeyra. Messages between the two reportedly showed Takeyra accusing Johnson of pulling her hair, insulting her and pulling a gun on her. Johnson apologized for some of his conduct and asked for another opportunity. Then the relationship deteriorated. Takeyra wanted to move on. She had begun another relationship. She was looking at ways to protect herself. And then she was dead. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't coincidence. They argued it was motive. The defense disagreed with the prosecution's interpretation. But ultimately, the jury had to decide which version of events made sense when all the evidence was considered together. And after hearing the case, the jury reached its decision. On September 2, 2022, Armand Johnson Sr. was found guilty. 4 people had died, and the jury found Johnson responsible. But there was another enormous question: would he receive the death penalty? Prosecutors had pursued capital charges. The indictment contained death penalty specifications. The evidence involved multiple murders, including the killing of a child. And prosecutors had argued for the harshest possible punishment. But the jury did not recommend death. Instead, Johnson received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and the sentence was severe. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. 4 lives, 4 sentences, no possibility of release. But even after sentencing, the legal battle wasn't over. Johnson appealed his convictions, and his appeal would force the courts to revisit some of the evidence that had convinced the jury. The appeal challenged several aspects of the trial. Among the issues were the admission of evidence concerning his previous alleged abuse of Takeyra. There were also challenges involving DNA evidence, cell phone evidence, photographs, and the overall strength of the prosecution's case. The appeals court reviewed those arguments, and on January 18, 2024, the Ohio 8th District Court of Appeals affirmed the convictions. The court did not find that the trial had produced a reversible error that justified overturning the verdict. That meant the convictions remained in place, and Johnson's life without parole sentence remained intact. But there is something important to understand about an appeal. An appellate court isn't simply holding another trial. It reviews whether legal errors occurred and whether the conviction should stand under the applicable standards. So when the appeals court upheld the conviction, it wasn't saying that every single piece of evidence was beyond debate. It was saying that the defense had not demonstrated a legal basis sufficient to overturn the convictions. And that distinction matters when telling this story accurately. Because true crime isn't just about creating suspense. It's about understanding what was alleged, what investigators found, what prosecutors argued, what the defense challenged, and what the courts ultimately decided. And in this case, the court record tells us something especially important. The prosecution's case wasn't built around one dramatic confession. It was built around a collection of circumstances and forensic evidence: the alleged motive, the deteriorating relationship, the messages, the domestic violence evidence, the blood, the DNA, the gas can, the cell phone, the ballistics, the fire, and the deaths of 4 people. The jury decided those pieces were enough to establish Johnson's guilt. But there is still a question that remains emotionally difficult. Takeyra was 25, her son was only 6, her daughter was only 2, and David Cousin was 35. 4 people who began that day with lives ahead of them never got another chance to see what those lives could become. For Takeyra, the tragedy is particularly painful because the evidence presented in court suggested that she had been attempting to rebuild her life. She had ended the engagement. She had reportedly sought information about domestic violence. She had begun another relationship. She had traveled with someone she appeared to be happy with. And yet, according to prosecutors, the danger she was attempting to escape eventually followed her home. That doesn't mean every detail of the prosecution's theory should be treated as an unquestionable fact. It means the evidence presented in court led a jury to a specific conclusion, and that conclusion was upheld on appeal. The case also raises a broader question that goes beyond this particular courtroom. What happens when someone tries to leave a relationship that has become dangerous? Sometimes people around the situation see the warning signs. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes victims tell friends, co-workers, or family members what is happening. Sometimes they search silently for ways to escape. And sometimes the final escalation happens with terrifying speed. That is part of what makes the Slavic Village case so haunting. Because when investigators arrived, they weren't dealing with a single victim. They were dealing with an entire family tragedy. A mother, 2 children, and a neighbor. And the neighborhood had to live with the aftermath. The case eventually became one of the most serious prosecutions in Cleveland. Johnson was convicted. The death penalty was rejected. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. And in 2024, the appellate court upheld his convictions. But perhaps the most haunting part isn't the courtroom. It's what came before it. A relationship that had once been about marriage and family. A woman who reportedly wanted to leave. A series of arguments and allegations. A growing sense of fear. And then, in a matter of hours, 4 lives were gone. If you have stayed with Crime of Desire this far, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the evidence presented at trial formed a convincing case against Armand Johnson? Was the cell phone evidence the most disturbing part to you? Or was it the fact that prosecutors said the children were still alive when the house was deliberately set on fire? And here's another question. Do you think cases involving domestic violence should receive greater intervention before they escalate into deadly violence? Tell me what you think in the comments. Please keep the discussion respectful, especially when talking about Takeyra, her children, and David. And if you believe stories like this should be told with context, not just sensational headlines, subscribe to Crime of Desire. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation, because every case has more than a headline. Behind every courtroom number is a person. Behind every crime scene is a family. And behind every verdict is a story that deserves to be understood. The Slavic Village murders ended with a conviction. But for the families who lost their loved ones, there was never going to be a real ending. There would only be memories, questions, and 4 empty spaces where 4 people should still be. This has been Crime of Desire. Stay curious, stay informed. And remember, the truth isn't always found in the loudest accusation. Sometimes it's hidden in the evidence, and sometimes the smallest detail can change everything.